Hello, I'm Maisa Al Qassimi, Programs Manager at the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi under TCA. Thank you for joining us today for some rare insight into the collection being acquired by Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, but importantly, to hear about the research process and thinking that frames these works. Guggenheim Abu Dhabi will promote the understanding and appreciation of contemporary art, architecture, and other manifestations of modern contemporary visual culture from an international perspective. It highlights the transcultural nature of art beginning in the 1960s, looking across cultures and examining the influence of multiple cultural sources on artistic production. Of course, the museum's collection owned by the government of Abu Dhabi is one component of a wider effort to realize this project. Guggenheim Abu Dhabi team is growing, expertise is being cultivated, and we're constantly challenging and rethinking the presentation of this collection from a new perspective, a new canon, and of course with a strong focus on art from the Middle East, or in our terminology, West Asia. And Valerie will explain our thinking behind this term, exploring the specific identity derived from the cultural traditions of Abu Dhabi and the United Arab Emirates. Today, we will share some clips of highlights from our 2013 program, including our Seeing Through Light exhibition, which attracted record numbers of attendees and to our delight went viral on social media across the world. We welcome you today and hope you return for more of our program in 2016 to be part of this conversation. I now invite Valerie Hillings, Curator and Manager of Curatorial Affairs for the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi Project, to speak. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for being here this afternoon. I'm just realizing, however, the clicker for my PowerPoint is not on the podium. So if someone can bring that to me. Welcome, though, while I'm waiting for that. And we have really, it's so great because our whole team is here today in this room, and I stand here to represent them because so many of us are, as Maisa said, trying to think. Thank you very much. First, I just want to welcome you into our house. That was my main goal. We're working together to think about the intellectual opportunities, the participatory opportunities, and the engagement opportunities that a collection can offer. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a little taste of, situate you a little bit, if you will, inside the future Guggenheim Abu Dhabi building. I'm going to talk about some of the key principles that we've established for the collection and share quite a number of highlights. And some of them have been, as Maisa pointed out, in 2013, we had quite a number of artists here in Abu Dhabi. We're going to continue that. So we're going to kind of toggle between the imaginary and the real. Many of you probably remember or know that one of the distinctive features of Frank Gehry's design are these magnificent cones that encircle the building, which you just saw in the first picture. But we want you to imagine yourself for a moment with us walking up this majestic ramp underneath the cone with its glulam timbers and finding yourself suddenly inside a building that is has a lot of glass, it has a lot of high-ceilinged galleries. It's actually a quite different building than the one that the Louvre and the Sheikh Zayed Museum have. So what we thought we would do today is share some of those distinctive features. As Maisa noted, and many of you will have read, we are thinking about what we call a transcultural perspective, and I'm going to go into this in some depth in a moment. But really, the notion of interconnection is extremely important to us, to think about how artists are having dialogues together and with other artists that they may know or not know across time and space. The key principles that we established for the collection at the outset were that it would begin in the 1960s and span to the present, and ambitiously would look at artists working around the world, not just in particular parts of that world, but that we would also have a dedicated focus, a strength, a great passionate strength within the collection in the areas of West Asia, North Africa, and South Asia. And as Maisa said, I'm going to delve into that West Asia thing in a minute, but just to introduce you to this concept. And of course, contemporary art is not just a painting on a wall anymore. It can be an installation with lights like our Kusama that you saw last year, or it could be an idea written on a wall. This is the first floor of the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. unlike other museums in the Guggenheim constellation, Guggenheim Abu Dhabi will always have a significant, nearly 5,000 square meter display of its collection at any given moment. As you see here, I think the pointer will work, maybe, yes. This is that entry cone I just showed you a second ago. You go inside into the building envelope, and there are these series of galleries, many of which, as I'll show you in a minute, have 2 different ceiling heights, some of which sit outside the actual building envelope. So, let me see if I can find it. Some of these in the back are you literally go outside. What you're seeing on this slide is one of the ways we wanted to think about art history. We've been talking a lot as our team and with experts from around the world, what have museums always done? Well, museums very often have taken you on a journey through time, beginning at the beginning and going to the ending. So we had this discussion, do we really want to be totally chronological? And we decided that, and I'll show you why in a minute, but we will not lose chronology, but we are not about taking you on a progressive journey that suggests that there's a logical 1 point to 2 point. And in addition, we're not looking at separating geographies alone. So each of these narratives that you're seeing outlined here will actually tell a kind of finite story from 60s to the present. Something like popular culture and the mediated image will certainly have American pop art. It will also, as we'll see in a minute, have Sakahana art from Iranian artists and other stories. But across time, we will be keeping some of those specific histories together to honor that, to acknowledge it. But we will also not lose the fact that some of these themes we have found are very elastic, and you can imagine artists working with them across time. These are the ones we're working with now. They may change, they may evolve, and in fact, if you look at abstractions, seeing through light was sort of a subset of that theme for us. I just want to briefly share with you the context of the building, because I think it's really important. As we've been thinking about building a collection, how do you deal with the fact that in each gallery you often have 2 heights? How do you deal with the fact that 6 meters is the lowest ceiling height in the entire set of galleries? These are things that curators have to think about, but imagine having to think about that with something like this and not standing inside it. So it's an interesting and profound challenge for all of us to figure out how to do this the best way. So that gives you one sense. This other gallery, 102, has multiple ceiling heights and also timbers in it and a skylight. So there's going to be some natural light. There's going to be some things that are just contained. There are galleries like this one where you have a long one attached to the back. Typical of Frank Gehry, they're not all right angles, so we are dealing with some serious curvature and organic structure. Something like this is the gallery that I was mentioning, that you go outside the building and find yourself in a sort of separated gallery. So that's where we're thinking of what we're calling a collection focus. And then there are 3 other levels. So imagine that you see this collection on level 1, and then you find yourself on level 2 with all of the purple galleries that you see here. On level 3, the sort of gray knockouts are the galleries. And then on level 4, very distinctive galleries, including one that is literally the entire height of the Guggenheim in New York. So we're dealing with a lot of verticality, a lot of interesting forms, and so Frank certainly was thinking about contemporary art, but it's definitely set a wonderful bar for what the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi can be. So I'm going to set forth for you a few of the key principles today, and I'm going to illustrate it with artworks, as I said. So the first thing I want to start with is our chronology, which we decided consciously to start in the 1960s. Of course, there was a lot of debate. Many of the curators that had that debate are here in this audience today, and the natural fit would, for us and who are trained classically in Western art history, was to think of 1945. And then the more we talked about it, the more we thought, well, where does the contemporary moment really begin, as we think of it? And we really felt that the 1960s made a tremendous amount of sense, because the way that the world could be seen was sort of rapidly changing. There was the advent of television. The airplane travel became easier. I like using this image of Rauschenberg because we landed a man on the moon. So literally and figuratively, the world was completely transformed within that decade. Cataclysmic social events occurred, something and it wasn't just in one place. And then, of course, artists started finding ways to find each other. They were driving across borders, and I always talk to the European artists, and it was, did they take the Fiat or did they take the VW? And then, really international magazines occur. And of course, within a lot of the parts of the world, we finally see the end of a colonial period. It's not as though it started in the 60s, but certainly we see the radical formation of nation states, especially on the continent of Africa. So 60s for us, we really want, the media part is really important. We have been lucky to collect a work such as Rauschenberg's that you see on the screen, which kind of epitomizes this, but also the idea that we're not forgetting about the past, because this is an artwork that dialogues with art history. Similarly, this work by Marisol, which is actually a portrait of Andy Warhol that has his real shoes. For us, what we realized is how all of us live through the icons of our own era. And certainly Andy was so iconic, but also just a personal friend of Marisol. This also signals to us that in the 60s, there was a lot of kind of incredible cross currents and exchange between artists in a given city and then also beyond. And then in the same moment, popular culture doesn't have to be American pop art. In fact, it very much isn't in many cases for us. And so we chose the term popular culture, particularly because someone like Zendaruti, a founding artist of the Sakahana school in Iran in 1962, was looking at his own popular culture, at the Persian popular culture, and looking at the vernacular in images such as these two that we have in the collection. And then looking at something even, and of course we begin to see a lot of everyday materials, and so someone like Günter Uecker literally makes this dancing figure with nails, and it literally moves and dances. And so in its kind of wild performance, it's emulating Sufist dancing, Günter Uecker's love of going to a discotheque, frankly, and also his engagement with people in the United States when he was there who were involved with movements such as the Black Panther movement. So it's all these kind of ideas of expression that are coming to the fore. And the name New York Dancer talks about the condition that artists, again, were traveling. Uecker was there in '64 and then made this work for an exhibition in Amsterdam. Last little bit of 60s. A key part of why we chose the 60s as well is because conceptual art practice comes to the fore. The use of language, the use of also materials, such as you see here, an everyday casserole filled with wax. These ideas of transformation, of representation are changing at that moment, and including the performative. So last year we acquired this work by Rashid Arain, an incredibly important figure who had an exhibition in Sharjah a couple of years ago, where he came from Pakistan to London, and in the late 60s pioneered, along with his colleagues in other countries, the idea that he wanted the spectator to become activated. And so in this case, these are replicas of the discs that he encouraged people to throw into the Thames and let them flow down the river, which was a way of thinking about about migration, about coming into a new place and flowing into the existing body of the place. We're starting to understand our building, not just through that kind of building representation we showed you, but renderings are always important. So you see here the Arain installed. And similarly, our American and European pop. And this is just to show you, there's a Jacques Villeglé on the right, a great important representative of Nouveau Realism in France. We're keeping the chapters together. These artists knew each other, they spent time together, but in the back you see another chapter that I'm going to get to in a minute. So we're really trying, as I said, within one and the same thing, you see interconnection, but you don't lose specificity. Okay, the harder one, transcultural perspective. When we started thinking about this collection, we very consciously chose not to use global. We felt that global was very much a Western term, it was an economic term, and in its essence, it often implies homogeneity. And what is so fundamental for Guggenheim Abu Dhabi is to have multiple perspectives and multiple voices and ideas. And we started out with the idea of the transnational. I think any of you who have followed us know we started there. And then in the course of, we convened two groups of absolutely wonderful scholars here in Abu Dhabi, and they kept challenging us, because we like that. And they said, well, the national has to do with national borders. Are people really unified by what borders they live within? Because borders change, and also it brings together many different people. there's the fundamental tenets of culture have to do with language, religion, even represent, kind of books that you read or music that you love. And transculture implies cultural exchange, so you're not just talking about politics, you're talking about cultural developments. And so for us, we kind of, at the end of the second one of these convening sessions in 2012, we felt transcultural would really be the right thing for us. And emblematic of that for all of the team was something such as Boetti's Mappa. I just share with you that we had a long journey to find this work of art together. And one of the reasons we wanted it is because we wanted to think about this idea of borders changing, of exchanges. And so in this case, we wanted 1989, which everybody knows was a pretty fundamentally year of change, where we saw the fall of the Berlin Wall, we saw the Tiananmen Square student protests, we saw the end of the Soviet-Afghan War. So many things were happening, and this map still has 2 Germanys, which of course is no longer the case. It has 2 languages, the Western and the Farsi. And at the same time, this is an artist who would take his work and send it to weavers ultimately in Pakistan, but first in Afghanistan before the Soviet invasion. So it's really about this idea of exchange, of really involving people across different contexts. Secondarily and iconically for us is we were thinking for years, how do we do Warhol? You could absolutely do a Marilyn, you could do an Elvis, you could do all kinds of different things. But we started talking, and you'll see in a minute, early on in our collection, we formed a very important core group of Chinese art from the 1990s and 2000s. So Mao Zedong was already hanging out in our collection, so to speak. And then we thought about when Warhol made these series of portraits, he was responding at first on a basic level that Mao was the most famous person in the world at the time, but secondarily, he was responding to the fact that the US President, Richard Nixon, had gone to China to try to open up relations. So we thought, okay, an icon of his time. Now he has a lot of different meanings, to be sure, but also we were pretty excited about, on a basic level, that it had this kind of gestural quality. It went away from that precision you saw with Rauschenberg. And then something that many of you may have seen in Seeing Through Light, YZ Kami's Endless Prayers, is a case of taking different sources of prayer, different languages, and bringing them together in one place. So really what we're thinking about is when can things that are different live inside the same place, and what does that say? And then a last example, and probably the fundamental example of transcultural for us, is Elinat Sui's work, where he takes the bottle caps of found bottles and has them sort of hammered flat. He has assistants that then weave it together in these absolutely amazing hanging sculptures. In the case of this work, we liked it because it's speaking about Earth's skin, which is about also ecological issues. But I'm going to share with you now a clip, because we had El here on the stage, my colleague Faisal and myself, and we kind of teased out from him, why did we make the right choice on this piece? And thinking about the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi as being a place of just, we hope it's going to be a superstar collection, this has become the emblematic image for all of El's work in many ways. And so what you're going to hear from him is, it's not just even the idea that bottle caps are part of a trade that emerged during a period of slavery in the United States, and then the bottle caps themselves going through different hands. There's different levels of history, but he talks about a specific history that links this work to the UAE. So I'm going to share that with you.
I did this work in Africa, and it's gone to Japan and other places. Well, it started from the UAE and gone to Japan and the US and Norway, and finally it had to be the one to come back to this place. There's something curious about it. I don't know, you selected it, I don't know why you selected it. You didn't know all this before you selected it. so it's something curious, yeah.
So it's fantastic to imagine. I mean, it's funny, you think about all those historical associations, but artworks themselves have a history and a journey to get them to where they go. Just another one of our renderings, thinking about that very shaped gallery that we just shared with you. In the foreground, you see Hassan Sharif's work that I'm going to speak about in a moment, but there's this absolute, also we've been very fascinated as a team in those artists using recycled materials, in finding those things that have a past history and reimagining their potential, often resulting, as we see, in aesthetic beauty and also in important commentary on our time. So Maisa and I had promised the discussion of West Asia. So these convening sessions that we've been having, there's been a lot of discussion, of course, inevitably about the history of colonialism. And consistently in both of them, the dialogue turned to the issue of calling where we are standing today the Middle East. And I think that through that, the dialogues with our experts, through the work of our own staff members, very much so, there's been a discussion about can we take away that term, take away that imposing of that term, and think of something more productive and open, and also interconnecting. So West Asia has been proposed because West Asia encompasses the Gulf, the Levant, Iran, and Turkey. And when you join that to North Africa and South Asia, you have an incredible history, an area that has had constant exchange, constant mutual support. Thinking in the 1970s, particularly about how the UAE and the Gulf embraced artists from other parts of the region who were in their own countries were torn asunder, and they could come here and be creative. So this is something that we feel very strongly about, and we also believe by calling it a focus, it shows that we're leading from that perspective historically. It's not just folded in here and there, it's absolutely a lead in our narrative. I'm going to show you kind of a divide of things. There's two key areas we're looking at, back to the narratives: abstractions, which are often manifest in language, and then also figuration. So Zendaruti, who I showed you in the beginning, this was his partner or one of his co-artists in Sakahana School, Tanavoli's great Big Hish, where he really interrogates Hish, and formally and conceptually. And this is one of the largest that he ever made in the period of the 70s. For us, also really important to see the kind of great thinkers of this part of the world. And Shakar Hassan al-Said was not only a founder of the One Dimension Group in Iraq, but also one of the great writers of thinkers about art history and about how one can take art and intervene or connect to issues of the divine, issues of contemplation. In this case, you're looking at a kind of, it's hard to see on a slide. I wish I had the reel to show you, but something that looks like a wall but has this almost graffiti-like interrogation of language. He's doing some numbers. So for us, he's a very fundamental figure because he was always a leader in history, and sometimes many history books don't acknowledge that. Equally, someone like Farhad Bokahia, a leading figure in the Casablanca School in Morocco, was using natural materials. So the great thing about contemporary art is you see a whole wide range of materials, some of which they don't teach you to handle in grad school, as I like to say, but I think we can handle the leather. And in this case, this kind of abstracted representation of a natural scene of the forest. And then coming into the contemporary moment, you probably saw last year Arhada Amer, that was the words I love the most, inscribed across a patinated sculpture. This is just kind of another sneak peek as to how we're thinking about things in the galleries. You know, seeing scale is really important, and imagining whether these smaller works work well with the larger works. And then thinking about the figurative, we were really very pleased to acquire this early Louis Kaili from his paintings of fishermen. It's very, you know, a lot of artists are looking at what we would call social realism. They're looking at the conditions of life, of the poetics of life, and in this case, I think it's always important to us to get these key artists. Some of you may have joined us for Adel El-Siwi's talk here with my colleagues here in my team, and Adel is one among a number of artists that we've been acquiring they're born in the 1950s, so they lived their young life in Nasser's Egypt, and now in the 2000s have looked back with great nostalgia and also with analysis to what they grew up with. I think we all do that. We all think about those things and who are the icons. So part of the education of many members of this team, myself included, was learning about Kulthum and how iconic she is. You know, we all knew Marilyn in our art history classes, but we realized she's going to be a great icon of this collection with Adel's piece, but also in Shant Abedizian's works, this sort of amazing triptych on cardboard where he really brings forward a lot of symbols and points in history. Here, Kulthum is literally the embodiment of the Arab world, and then something more interesting about women going to work in the middle under Nasser. So we're really looking at building these bridges and these what we call clusters within the collection. Another related theme, we had Yusuf Nabil here, how, a lot of times we don't think, what is the nature of studio photography? How can it be, is it a language that contemporary artists can still connect to? And certainly by doing the old hand-painted technique and having these incredible portraits, Yusuf has done that. Equally, Akram Zatari, who's taken us inside the studio Scheherazade in Saida to kind of bring us back in time. And I think that what we've realized is a great percentage of the collection we're building reflects the fact that contemporary artists are looking back to the past. They're reconstructing histories, they're questioning history, and helping us to understand anew where we come from. Just a couple of last examples. We obviously are also really interested in installations. It's something, installation and video are very much the language of our post-60s world. Many of you may have seen Hassan Han's piece, or actually I should say heard Hassan Han's piece in The Seeing Through Light, where he kind of blends together different interpretations of Shabi music. And then for us, a really important artist is Mohammed Kazem. Sometimes we want to show depth, which I'm about to shift into, and that means buying art from different periods of the career. And in this case, his earlier documentations of going out into the water and finding himself, figuring out what his coordinates were, but then plunging the viewer inside this wonderful installation on the right that was not only in Venice Biennial, but also seen here in Abu Dhabi a couple of years ago in Emirati Expressions. The universal condition of asking, where am I and where am I going? So for us, this is a very emblematic work. So collecting in depth. The Guggenheim in New York, one of its founding principles was collecting in depth, because we realized early on, in fact, Richard Armstrong yesterday was talking about the 1930s, so I will take us back in time for a moment, that sometimes it's best to, when you can't be encyclopedic, it's best to do some things in depth and show what your artists were about. Depth is going to take on a lot of different forms for us. So on the one hand, we're looking at certain artists working in the same moment. So here you have Nobuo Sekine, who was a member of the Manaha group that emerged in the late 60s in Japan. These are 2 volumes, big volumes that are filled with water. So you have this kind of tension between the material world and this natural world. And I think this dialogue between nature and culture runs throughout the collection. But what's important is he was doing that while colleagues in Japan, just a little generationally, just a teeny hair ahead of him, like Tanaka, were in part of the Gutai group, and a lot of what they were doing had to do with performance. So Tanaka would literally wear a dress of colored light bulbs, and then she made these paintings which kind of refer to that. And then finally in this kind of set is a series of paintings, a triptych, an amazing triptych by Liu Fan. And imagine this idea of writing as contemplation runs throughout this collection. So he's literally taking paint and running with his brush until it runs out at the end. Another artist in depth. So that was sort of a movement in depth, if you will, or a time in depth. We've also made a strong commitment to Munir Sharudi Farman Farmayan. This work was in Seeing Through Light, a very important early mirror relief. And we've also acquired her more recent work. It's one of the hardest things to remember is just because an artist goes later into a career doesn't mean they're not still reinventing things. And so for us, Munir is one of those key artists. But if anyone has actually become a sort of signature foundational artist for this collection, it is definitely Hassan Sharif. And I think it's been amazing. It's an amazing achievement and wonderful to have been able to dialogue with Hassan Sharif about this, to get all of his key bodies of work. So as you see listed out there, his experiments, his objects, his performances, and his semi-systems are all these key bodies. And so we have really made an effort. You've seen in the previous renderings the objects. They can live in many different contexts for us. So I think that on the one hand, we can show our audience an artist in great depth in one place, and on the other hand, you can meet him in different contexts. For us, one of the most interesting parts of his practice, though, is definitely his performances. And performance is something that the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi will collect, will commission, and sometimes it'll be documentation, and sometimes it'll be live, and so I'm going to just let Hassan tell you in his own words about the desert.
خلينا بالأخص نحكي أكثر عن هدول البرفورمانسز. في عدد منهم عملتهم إحنا اقتنينا كل البرفورمانسز. طبعا. اللي هي كل يعني المجموعة الكاملة من التوثيق للبرفورمانسز اللي أنت عملتها في فترة ما بين 79 لل 83 و 84 مش هيك؟ هذه الفترة. بهاي الفترة. بدي تحكي لي عن بالأخص البرفورمانسز اللي عملتها في دبي. نبلش بدبي وتحكي لنا كيف وبالصحراء walking
جميل كلمة الصحراء، كثير جميلة. أنا كنت أحب أسوي شيء له علاقة بالمنطقة هذه، فما كان أمامنا إلا الرمل، إلا الصحراء، إلا هذا الصحراء اللي ما لها نهاية وما لها بداية، وأيضا الصحراء غير محدد، ما لها خريطة. الصحراء يعتبر أيضا مثل ما نحن نعيش في غرفة، في شقة أو في البيت، من غرفة نتحرك من غرفة الجلوس إلى غرفة النوم إلى غرف أخرى. الإنسان البدوي أيضا يتحرك في الصحراء كلها يعتبر بيته، فيتحرك مثل ما نحن نتحرك، هو أيضا يتحرك سواء راح اليمين أو يسار، مش الاتجاهات غير محددة، ممكن يكون غرفة نومه على يساره أو على يمينه فحسيت أنه أجمل شيء أقول أتحدث عن المنطقة هو الرمل والصحراء.
We were really interested when Hassan Sharif came and joined us here on the stage with the German artist Heinz Mock in our collection, because one of the points of interconnection we found was that they were both inspired by the desert. And to have a German artist talk about going into the Sahara with his sculptures that the sort of totemic sculptures you saw in Seeing Through Light, and then Hassan making the performances, we realized that there are things that may not be textbook, we may not know about, but when you find them, there's an amazing poetry. And at the end of that great panel that Reem and Maisa and I co-moderated, the two gentlemen said they'd like to meet in the desert here in the UAE. So, these unexpected things happen. So we're looking for that as another form of depth. This is the Semi-Systems by Hassan. So you see that his practice is incredibly diverse, and I think this is extremely exciting for us, again, to be able to show different contexts. I mentioned earlier that we have a great representation of very iconic Chinese art of the 90s and 2000s. And so this is a work by Huang Yongping, The Theater of the World and the Bridge. And we had some great conversations, especially with our conservation colleagues, because inside this snake-like structure, there are, let's say critters, real critters. And part of this project is about a theater of the world and of life, has both life and death and interaction. And so it's definitely a very interesting thing. Again, as I sort of referred to, they don't teach you about this in graduate school. You don't know how to deal with bugs in graduate school necessarily. And so we're really excited to try out and bring to the fore these different ways of thinking. Another strain within the Chinese was Feng Mengpo, who was also with us here in 2013, who, like many people of his generation, decided that he wanted to think about video game imagery. He was very interested in that. He knew Atari, and many of you in the room will not have understood what I said when I said that. But in any case, early days of the playing, and Super Mario Brothers was very inspirational to him. So he decided that it would be very interesting, like many members of his generation, to reinterpret the historic moment of the Long March in 1934-35, where Mao Zedong is the kind of protagonist, of course, and that's the part of his great mythology. So thinking back to our Warhol Mao, this was the kind of work that inspired that choice. And so for Mengpo, it was he really didn't want to just stay in painting. And so when we began to think about the collection and growing it, we decided we wanted to have his interactive video game piece that was finally being able to realize real time. And here he is in Abu Dhabi, helping to teach some of the local colleagues and young people to engage with it. So I think that what we've been thinking about for the Abu Dhabi collection is interactivity, of getting people involved. And this was a really important piece for us. And Mengpo, was just so excited to be here. He spent, I think, a week with us. And I'm just going to let him tell you in his own words how happy he is to be in the collection.
But now this one, is turned to Guggenheim Abu Dhabi. I think this is much better than just like a private collection in the storage. Now it's more and more people, they can really see the works, and that is very, really happy.
We kept finding this time and again. It's great. Our family of artists is growing. And so the sort of last area that I really want to cover today with you is what we call defining bodies of work. And this can take many different forms, but I think that one of the things we all, well, at least certainly in our team, talk about every day are what are the artworks you never forget? What are the things you see and 5 years later you remember them and they draw you in and you maybe don't know why, or then maybe you do. And so we've been really thinking about that. And of course, as you could imagine, I should say on a team that has, I have to count us up, around 10 voices at any given moment, there are a lot of opinions and there are a lot of thoughts. And I think that what's been great is to have that debate and that dialogue and then to see things together, which is so profoundly important. Thinking about our popular culture theme, we of course thought about Murakami, who's such a pioneer of a kind of post-pop, or what he called super flat, where he was looking at older traditional art, looking at manga, and also here, in this case with Tangori-kun, he's looking at a Buddhist figure, he's thinking about an antenna on the top that can bring signals and communications in, and he's literally sitting on a frog. So we thought that this was an incredibly playful, wonderful piece. It is quite big, you can see the dimensions there on the screen, and I think given our building, he should be a great greeter. We've been thinking of him as a greeter to the building. The work that I think many people in the audience know very intimately from being in our Seeing Through Light show, of course, is the Kusama mirrored room installation. Kusama originated this practice in the 1960s, so for us we were thinking, again, I mean, things do come back from the 60s into the present and sometimes even get better. So in this case, the immersive and magical experience of walking through a water and light landscape, almost through the cosmos, we felt was incredibly important as a defining body. We also acquired a cell by Louise Bourgeois, the French-born, later U.S. citizen artist, who, in this particular case, it's funny, so many people know her work, it is very personal, but in this particular case, we were intrigued by the fact she was responding to a painting in the National Gallery in London by the artist Turner, a landscape that has an incredibly blue sky, in every aspect, a quite traditional painting, although modern at the same time. And so with Louise, she translates that into blue water in mason jars that are pretty much the jam she was eating every day and saving. And then the form in the middle refers to her own practice, this sort of 1970s latex type sculpture, and then mirrors, because in Louise's case with the cells, there's this idea of reflection, of containment and thinking about everything around you. And so for us, I think also, so many artists are looking at structure and things that are built into the space that you can either enter, as in Kusama, or you can't, as in Bourgeois. Another work that originates in the 60s in its spirit, but also has a second life, let's call it, in the 90s. In 1966, in the Indika Gallery in London, Yoko Ono presented her first all-white chessboard, Play It by Trust. If one thinks back to that moment in the 60s, certainly there were, as in our present moment, and specifically in this exact moment, it's absolutely critical to imagine the possibility of not having opponents, of seeing a common ground and being together. And this is a message that we feel very strongly about. And when she remakes this in the 90s and expands it, well, this is right after those events of 1989 that I was mentioning earlier. So for us, it just shows you that those sentiments remain current and fresh across time and into the present. Going just for 1 minute back to the transcultural, for us, there are a lot of artists. It's funny, you're probably noticing, maybe, in our slide captions, we like to say where people live and work. And we had a great debate among our team members. When you're introducing an artist, do you say where they're born? Do you say where they live and work? And I think for all of us, we realize that so many people today are not living where they were born. They are absolutely the sum of their parts. They may be working, one day they may be working in Abu Dhabi, the next day New York, the next day Tokyo. And so we want to capture that aspect. And in this case of Doho Sa's work, he literally takes this amazing diaphanous fabric and he ghosts out the apartment he was living in Berlin during his DAAD fellowship. So we liked this idea of these kind of spaces of memory, spaces of personal history, and we've sort of paired it up. Here's a rendering, and in a second I'll show you the actual image, with a work by Haegyue Yang. So imagine these are two artists from Seoul, and yet they're spending time in in Berlin, because here's He Yueyang's piece. So basically, they're in her case, she's taking everyday objects, literally sort of the shower, the tall one is her shower, other ones are appliances, and she's interpreting on two sides what her house is like in one city and what it is in another. And so we're really thinking about this fundamental condition of where is home, where is the heart, where is the mind. In terms of major bodies of work, I mean, we've already shown you Mohammed Kazem's work that was in the Venice Biennial. The Venice Biennial, of course, is a very important place for major works of art to be shown by artists working internationally. And so we actually chose this work by the Polish artist Monika Sosnowska, which was commissioned for the Polish Pavilion back in 2007. And what she's done is thinking about prefabricated buildings in her native Poland back in the communist era, thinking about how they no longer sort of stand, they're falling down, they belong to another era. And so she decided to transform that idea of the kind of precarious collapse into this sculptural building. And it's funny, we had seen this installation not in Venice, but in the Schaulager, where the ceiling height is really high, and we all thought, oh my God, that's great for our high ceiling building. And then Monika came here to Abu Dhabi, and she said, no, you've got it all wrong. It has to be in a room with a ceiling pushing down on it. Lucky for us, that satellite gallery is just the right fit. So this is the important part of what we're doing as a collection building initiative, is we're really working with living artists and trying to understand what is the optimum experience. So I think when we stand in Gallery 107 together, we're going to be pretty awed by this structure. One of the things about this kind of defining bodies of work is we're also really interested in artists that spend sometimes even up to a decade on a given project. And so, one of the things you have to think about is, well, how do you decide which work? You know which artist, and how do you make sure you get the right thing? And so in the case of Abdallah Al-Sadi, this is again a piece that was shown in Venice in the UAE Pavilion prior to Mohammed Kazem, and it is his interrogation, his wonderful study and rumination, I think one could say, on the sweet potato and how it's both had a role in his own life, a role in the history of the UAE, and so it is this kind of amazing interrogation in different media of a fundamentally just a vegetable that often makes us think of humanity as well. So I think for us, knowing he invested 10 years in it, it made us want to invest in him by having it in the collection. Somewhat similarly, Kader Atia's major installation that was in the last Documenta, is really emblematic for us. I began a little earlier by talking about why we chose West Asia. And for our collection, we really want to undo some of the things that were not done right in the colonial era in terms of thinking. Kader here is doing something really interesting because he's thinking about history and he's thinking about representation. And so on the one hand, we all know that the history of Western modernism, a lot of the artists would borrow from African masks, and then they would say, I'm the avant-garde. They didn't always acknowledge where they came from. And so what Kader does, it's amazing. He takes something that you would expect to be an African sculpture and he makes it in marble. You take another figure and you do it in the wood that you think you would have a wooden mask in. So he's kind of reversing the terms of representation, but showing how both can live together. He's also showing us colonial texts and magazines. So he's really kind of forcing us inside the past, but then his message is one of, a term he coined is cultural reappropriation. And his idea is that we're all always borrowing from each other. And goodness knows, if I looked at all your iPods right now, I'm certain of that. Because we're all listening to different music that comes from everywhere. He is saying if we acknowledge what we borrow, if we can repair that history of the past. And in it, he also, of course, references the contributions of people from the colonized countries to their own colonizers through images of soldiers in World War I. So there's this kind of constant dialogue about and he was also writing, which I was struck by, about going into museum storages around the world and finding sculptures that had been broken or disfigured, and how, in the case of many of the African sculptures, they just fixed them, but not to do the perfect conservation where you don't see any seams. There's just a kind of idea that we need to accept things as they are sometimes. The Chinese group also includes Ai Weiwei's monumental chandelier, this beautiful chandelier, and it's funny because he tells the story of seeing Sergei Eisenstein's film October, which talking about transcultural, it's about, the film pans up the river and inside the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, and you see these massive chandeliers, and it's so interesting to imagine something that we would see every day. I was telling someone earlier, I got a little nervous at one of the hotels here recently when I saw about 7 of these in one space, but anyway, here in our context, in our high-ceilinged galleries, this kind of majestic experience of being alone with this light form, we take for granted what we see every day, and this is a message that artists since the 60s have been trying to tell us. Open your eyes and see things fresh. So I think something like the chandelier will give us that opportunity. Just 2 more things to share with you. Qureshi, many of you saw part of his work in our exhibition last year, Seeing Through Light. This is much like the Abdallah Al-Sadi piece. Qureshi spent a decade on this piece. And for us, what's so important is how he actually tried to interrogate the history of the poet Rumi by retracing his steps. And thinking about all of us, the journey that we take through life, what would it be like for each of us to walk back through our own key moments, let's say? So for him, he traces the poet's moments, and he would go to those places, work with local artisans, and create the different elements that comprise the work. So you see these kind of almost anthropomorphic sculptures that are clearly made from calligraphic form, but you can't really read it. These amazing ceramic bowls that were made by artisans that are then filled with the water and the roses. So for us, there was this interesting journey through time, through poetry, because poetry is another thing we're trying to interrogate through the collection. And then also what's really interesting about this is, I think he's particularly well known for this kind of work, but he's one of the first artists from North Africa who was acknowledged internationally as a pioneer of conceptual art. He appears in a major exhibition in the West early on in global conceptualism. So we're looking at this idea of living in different places and having different meanings as well. And then finally, I sort of started at the beginning talking about the 60s as a point where language becomes a big part of art. It's not always about an object on a wall. It often engages with the building itself, and I think that's why we're excited about our building, because we're going to do a lot of that. But Douglas Gordon began this, again, this is a long-term project, right? And in fact, it doesn't even really have a finite date. We may receive more texts imminently. But he, like all of us, every day you're walking around, you're talking to your friends, and they say a phrase. I mean, yesterday when we were here with the panel with those museum directors, I wrote down a couple things Neil McGregor said and my director said, and I think, these things we pick up along the way is what Douglas has written down, what he's overheard as well. And what we were really interested in is what it might look like in our building. And thanks to the wonders of rendering, we have seen, because this is a project where Douglas has invited the opportunity to have it in English and Arabic, and certainly one of the fundamental things about our museum will be that it will be welcoming in many languages. And I think for us, what's great, and this is why we love this rendering, is because if you read it, it says, "I still believe in miracles." And I think that one of the most important things for us is, yes, we have a lot of art that is challenging and asks a lot of the viewer, but we also want to create moments of wonder and experience, the unexpected. As Richard Armstrong said yesterday, what's great about contemporary art is it fires the imagination, and that's certainly what we hope this collection will do. Thank you. I believe I can take questions from the audience, but there are microphones. Is that right? All right. I was very clear, I can tell. I think that one of the other things I'd like to say is that Maisa referred to our program next year, and one of the things that we started this year, it's an interesting conundrum when you're trying to deal with the world, how to do it right, and I think we have a lot of great experts. I know we have a lot of great experts within our team. We're all doing primary research, but the other opportunity is to open the doors of our research to all of you. And we had this earlier this year, we decided we needed to really focus on Africa because we've done a lot with North Africa so far. but we need to kind of go a little south of there. And so we had one of the great experts who came and shared with us was Salah Hassan, who came and spoke here in this room about Afropolitanism. And I think what we realize is, while there's a lot of controversy about talking about a single country as though you can push it all into one box, understanding all these different contexts individually and then bringing them together is something really important. So for next year, we are going to be inviting experts in other, let's call them maybe specific countries and fields. We're also going to ask them to talk about something I didn't address in my main talk, but we've been talking with our colleagues about key dates in the world. When does the world see these paradigm shifts? I mean, the 60s is clearly a decade of that, but we're beginning to think about what are those years that had resonance both locally and internationally on different levels. So we were thinking about 1967 and 68 together as being very defining moment of something like 1989 and 90, because 89 starts something, and by 91 is when things sort of solidify. So we're going to, when we invite these people into this room and you into our house of thinking, we will be asking them to think about that, because sometimes artists do not reflect on the moment in the moment, but sometimes, like Adel El-Siwi and Sean Tabadizian, 20 years later, you see that prescience of that moment in the art. So this is another area of interrogation, and then this time next year, if you come back with us, we are going to bring together a lot of different thinkers, because we realize that people that are thinking about West Asian art or European art or African art, many of us have the same interests and concerns, because actually many artists are dealing with a lot of the same issues. So one of the goals of Guggenheim Abu Dhabi will be to use the collection, again, as I started out, to capture the specific, but also find the interconnection.